Hello, today we're going to review Competency 7 for the Texas PPR exam or the Texas Teacher Certification exam that covers pedagogy and professional responsibilities. This will also be a great review for my Educational Foundations class I teach. So, Competency 7 discusses effective instructional and communication practices for teachers. First of all, we needed to talk about when you're providing communication for your students, it needs to be developmentally appropriate. So, to ensure that your communication is developmentally appropriate, you need to consider your students' ages when you're communicating your lesson, when you're providing that instruction, when you're providing directions for students on what to do, and also when you're providing feedback for students. Another thing to note about developmentally appropriate communication is that you're using vocabulary terms that students already understand and are familiar with. You should also use, of course, grade appropriate vocabulary terms, but if you need to, you might need to pre-teach those vocabulary terms for some students who might not have heard them before. Another thing that's really important is that you need to state directions in a straightforward and simple manner. So you want to go straight to the point. You do not want to make your directions too wordy because that can confuse students. Another thing to note is that it's very important that you model to students correct communication. So you're going to need to both speak and write in complete sentences. This way you can model to students appropriate academic communication. Also, students might not understand how you explain things the first way, so many times you might have to rephrase or reiterate what you have said in a different manner. Moreover, if many times this happens actually with students, many times students might not answer in a complete sentence, or they might incorrectly use the vocabulary term, or maybe misuse a term, or maybe even omit using academic vocabulary terms that are related to the lesson. So one way that you can explicitly instruct students while not hurting their self-esteem is to rephrase what they said using a complete sentence and using the academic vocabulary that you're desiring your students to use in the lesson. Also, when you're rephrasing it, of course, you'll be providing a complete sentence using correct English grammar and pronunciation, which will be very beneficial for students who need additional support. Another thing to note about effective communication strategies is the concept of comprehensible input. Comprehensible input is basically just a fancy way to say making the lesson or making the teacher speech. So you presenting the lesson, your feedback and support for students during the lesson, making all of that teacher speech or their teacher talk understandable for students. And comprehensible input is especially beneficial for English language learners, although it is useful for all students because all students deserve and need to understand their teacher. So there's different ways you can provide comprehensible input, and we're going to talk about them. But as you'll notice, all of the times that when you're offering comprehensible input, many times you are going to modify or differentiate your communication style to best meet the needs of your students. And often this will involve offering significant scaffolds for students to understand what you're saying. And we're going to talk about them. So the key takeaway is you can't present your lesson the same way as you would talk to your friends or to adults or even slightly older students. You need to present the lesson based on students' developmental level and also based on students' English language ability level. So first of all, one way to provide comprehensible input is to write down any directions for an activity or a process during the lesson on the board. And if you need to, you not only could you write it down for those who have strong reading comprehension skills, but you might need to orally restate it in a simpler way for students who maybe have trouble with their reading comprehension, but also are still struggling with their grade level listening comprehension. Another thing to do to provide comprehensible input is to begin your lesson by providing an overview of what you're about to explain, basically giving students a roadmap of what they're going to learn. Furthermore, you can also break the lesson into manageable chunks or pieces of new information. And after you discuss each chunk of new information, you could pause and check for students' understanding. So ways you could do that is you could ask students to turn and talk to a partner and then share out something they learned from the lesson. You could pose a specific question and have students think about it. You could have students answer a multiple choice question using an electronic tool or device where they can answer instantaneously using one of their devices. Or you could even have students use physical gestures to represent their level of understanding, holding up a number of fingers to show how much they understood the lesson, or maybe even picking an option by voting with their fingers or with a guided response card or something like that. Either way, you want to frequently check to make sure students are understanding what you're teaching them. Another thing to note, especially for your beginners and intermediate English language learners, it's going to be very important that you slow down the pace of the lesson, and you might need to repeat key concepts. Even if students don't ask, if it's a very important concept, you might need to repeat it or even restate it in a different way, but going over and reviewing that concept. Another thing to note is that when you're designing your lesson, you want to make sure you sequence the lesson in a logical step-by-step manner. You also want to sequence your instruction based on starting out with easier content or most fundamental content first, and then gradually increase until you get to the more difficult or more challenging information that you're going to teach. Furthermore, the same goes for the types of thinking skills or rigor that you're providing for students in the activities they complete. So at the beginning of a lesson, and when you're just introducing something new, it's important to probably start out with kind of the basic levels of thinking. So if we looked at Bloom's taxonomy, for example, that would be using the skills of remember and describe. But then after that, eventually you want to expand on the rigor of the lesson so that eventually, once students are getting a hang of what they're learning, later in subsequent lessons, you want to make sure you challenge them with their critical thinking skills. You want to make sure that they apply their concepts to new situations, that they analyze or find the similarities and differences between what they're learning today and what they've learned before. Or also how to evaluate the importance of one part of information or one element over another. And then finally to create their own representation of their learning. So eventually you want to get students to those higher order thinking skills, but you don't want to start out right there or else it'll be overwhelming for students. Furthermore, comprehensible input also focuses on offering many different modeling opportunities, both you as a teacher providing that modeling, or also students' peers orchestrating that modeling for their students, for their partners, And so before you have students work independently, it's important that they see how to do the activity and that they practice with their peers. This will make them much more successful when they finally do the activity on their own. Another thing that's important about comprehensible input is to pre-teach key academic vocabulary terms that will be essential for that content lesson that you're about to teach. So you might need to begin, before you actually get into, let's say, a lesson on photosynthesis, you might need to first review the vocabulary terms of oxygen, or photosynthesis itself, or chlorophyll, or carbon dioxide. You might need to pre-teach those terms to students. Another thing you need to remember is overall, you need to have ongoing review of essential grade level vocabulary. And this could be during specific lessons, but it could also be at the beginning of the day or at the end of the day. And the importance of reviewing key grade level vocabulary terms in an ongoing, repeated, and comprehensive manner is that students will then be able to communicate themselves on grade level in grade appropriate ways. And so there's a nice link here below. I believe it was created by a school district called Sealy ISD, and they actually identified what were the key vocabulary terms and concepts in each grade level and in each content area, like math, science, social studies, etc. And so these are key terms that students must learn. And if you're teaching them content that's on grade level, which hopefully you are, you need to make sure that they're able to understand that content and it's comprehensible, and that they understand those key terms that you're using in your lessons or throughout the year. Finally, at the end of a lesson, to ensure comprehensible input, it's important that you summarize the lesson in a few simple sentences, emphasizing the key takeaways. One thing that could be beneficial for students, if let's say they're struggling with their listening abilities, but they have pretty strong reading comprehension abilities, probably because they have a strong reading comprehension skill set in their native language, would be to write down your summary of the lesson on the board and providing that key essential information for students in written format as well. Another thing to note is when you have students start to work with their partners or work on their own, whatever activity you assign, make sure that you give them the steps to complete the activity. And if possible, try to provide some kind of visual support so that students will be able to follow the steps even if they are struggling with their reading comprehension and understanding the reading of the steps. So once again, modeling for students repeatedly and having students practice with you to complete steps will also help them remember and know what they're supposed to do during the lesson, thus making your instruction and the activity comprehensible for students. Another thing that you should provide overall throughout the lesson and throughout all of your teaching is contextual support. Contextual support is basically giving students additional information or context clues to help them understand what is being said or what is being taught. And so some examples of contextual support could be visuals, so like pictures, photos. It could be videos. One type is like a digital jumpstart, where teachers might show a short instructional video before they get into the lesson to give students kind of a background knowledge of what they're about to explain. Next, another type of contextual support would be guided notes, where there's kind of like fill in the blank notes, but the key concepts are already identified for students, and students are guided with the teacher to fill in what they need to. Hand gestures and pantomime are a great way for someone to understand the overall gist of what a speaker is saying, even if they don't understand every specific word. Facial expressions can help students understand your meaning as well. Graphs and charts, and also graphic organizers, or ways to organize thinking, are useful. So students completing a graphic organizer could help them understand the concepts more and make sure that your input, your instruction is comprehensible for students. We've talked about this earlier, but having demonstrations, regular modeling, and experiments, those are also useful. Hands-on activities where students are having to physically do the activity or to manipulate something using counters or base 10 blocks or sentence strips. If their students are having to physically complete the activity, it's much more likely that they'll understand it. Even if they might not understand every single term or every single phrase that you say, the teacher, if they're doing it, they're understanding the main concepts. Verbal emphasis on key points can also help provide contextual support so students can realize what are the most important things they need to remember and when they really need to pay attention. Having a word wall where you have the letters of the alphabet on the wall and then you have um, the vocabulary you use during the lesson, the corresponding vocabulary you match to each letter that they fit under, and then teaching students and reminding students of the word wall can be helpful when students are trying to write on about the content, or if students are also trying to remember the meaning of key words. Sometimes having that visual reminder on the wall, and they can go back and think about how you had explained it to them as a teacher about what it meant, and it can kind of help it's more likely that it'll stick in their minds. And then finally, real objects or realia are very useful. So especially when you're teaching something new, as much as possible, try to incorporate real objects and then let students use those real objects if, of course, they're safe and appropriate for the lesson. So an example might be if you're teaching a lesson on 3D shapes, it would be great to have those 3D figures available for students to hold and to physically count the number of faces and to count the number of vertices or points. And so that's a really useful contextual support as well. Another thing that you have to remember is to provide for culturally appropriate communication. And so you have already probably seen this as a student or in your experience, your overall life experiences, your experiences in different professions. But as you've noticed, different cultures and even different parts of the country, for example, have different ways of communication. And so it's important that you adapt and adjust your communication style so that students not only understand what you're saying, but they also feel like the way you're communicating is appropriate and acceptable for them. Now, I'm not saying you have to totally shift your entire way of speaking and that you should ignore U.S. communication norms, but you also want to take into consideration that many students come from different cultural backgrounds and they might not have the same way of communicating or expressing their understanding or addressing someone in authority. And so you have to take that into consideration when you are interacting with the students to kind of take them as they are and try to, yes, you can explicitly teach some U.S. cultural communication strategies, but you also need to remember that the main goal is that students learn. And so it's not so much whose culture is being communicated the most effectively, but rather whether students are learning. And so let's talk about that in a little bit more detail. So, as we mentioned, different cultures have different ways of communicating. So, for example, in some East Asian cultures, eye contact, especially when you're making eye contact with someone who's older than you or an elder, or who has more authority than you, would be considered rude. And so that's a lot different than in the U.S. culture, where we are taught that in formal settings it's appropriate to make eye contact. For example, in other cultures like in Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia, using the left hand when interacting with people or when passing out communal goods like papers or supplies could be considered rude. Normally, the left hand is used for someone's personal life, and so it's rude to pass things out using your left hand. Also, in some Middle Eastern cultures, it can be looked down upon for men and women once they've reached puberty to be sitting very close to each other if they're not related to each other, or to also be forced to communicate for long periods of time. That can be many times uncomfortable for many students from some Middle Eastern cultures. And so I'm not saying that you should never group boys and girls together in your classrooms if you have students from the Middle East or whose families originated from the Middle East. But you should take that to mind that, and if you notice that some of your students are noticeably uncomfortable, you might want to modify your grouping so that students can best participate in the lesson. So once again, it's important to adapt your communication style to the needs of your learners. And we kind of mentioned this already, but one great way to know if you are effectively communicating and whether your communication is appropriate is by looking at the receiver of the communication, the listener. Pay attention to their nonverbal and also, of course, verbal reactions to what you're saying. So many times students, especially if they're younger, they probably will not directly tell you, oh, this communication makes me feel uncomfortable, but they might show it in other ways, like nonverbal ways. They might be hesitant to make eye contact, or they might be looking nervous, or they might be looking distracted or bored, or they might be looking upset or angry. That can show you that maybe the way that you're communicating is not meeting students' communication expectations, and there's a communication barrier. And rather than trying to reteach the student how to communicate under the norms you're used to as the teacher, it's probably more efficient for you and more effective if you just try to modify your communication in a way that students can understand. Another way is that to determine how students of the same culture can communicate is by observing students of the same culture interacting in social situations or in group work, or maybe even noticing how students interact with their parents. That can give you an idea of what students are used to in terms of communication norms. If you are not having that opportunity to really observe students socially, let's say at recess or maybe during lunch, or maybe you don't get to really see the students with their parents, then you can do your own background research, which can also tell you more about students' home cultures in general. And so one way to do background research would be to watch authentic TV shows or movies that are made by people who come from those host cultures, those home cultures, and you can watch how people interact and how they relate to each other, and what kind of obligations different generations have, and how people communicate with each other, and how close they sit, for example, or how close they are when they interact. And that can give you an idea of how students that you are teaching from those home cultures prefer to interact. Sorry, I'm a little itchy. Spring is coming, allergies. So another thing to note is that you want to make sure that you have, you consider the context of students' culture. And so normally we classify cultures based on low context cultures and high context cultures. So low context cultures would be kind of like the United States, Northwestern Europe, so like England, France, Germany, Switzerland, Russia. So in these cultures, in low context cultures, many times people are very straightforward, and they get right to the point. And so as we shift in this spectrum, you see that, for example, Southern European cultures like Italy and Spain, but also the Central American and Latin American cultures, as well as Africa and the Middle East, and South Asia and East Asia. In these cultures, many times they come from high context cultures. In high context cultures, people often first try to build a relationship before they get to the main point. So they might exchange pleasantries, they might talk a little bit, ask about people's families. They are more indirect or around the point when they're trying to explain something. And so this is something to remember. There's some more explanation below. So if you look at the interaction block in the middle, students from low context cultures often use they don't use a lot of nonverbal elements. It's mostly just the talking. Also, people from low context cultures, so like the US, for example, are very explicit and straight to the point. They're direct. And primarily, communication is used to exchange information or to get one's opinion or point of view across, or their wants and desires across. Communication has less of a social purpose, but more of a practical purpose. Um, and so, another thing is in low context cultures, disagreement is normally taken less personally. So, someone disagrees with another person, they can express it in a very civil and impersonal way, and people are less likely to be offended or to be upset if you express direct disagreement with someone's ideas. On the other hand, high context cultures like Africans, Asian, Latin American, Southern European cultures often use a lot of nonverbal communication. So they use their hands to give gestures. They have a lot of facial expression. They change the tone of their voice. Um, they move their eyes and have different forms of eye contact. Um, and they might even use physical contact to express a point, like patting someone on the shoulder or I guess maybe indicating with their eyes something. Another thing is that many times in high context cultures, the verbal message is not always straightforward. Many times people kind of are very descriptive, very elaborate, and they kind of describe around the point, especially if it's something kind of sensitive, before they actually get to the main topic that they're trying to express. So it's kind of an indirect form of communication. And many times communication serves a very unique social purpose, and it's almost like an art form. So it's important to be an effect. It's even more important to be an effective and artful and illustrative communicator when you're from a high context culture, because that really helps build relationships with people. Another thing is high context cultures often prefer to avoid direct disagreement, because when you directly voice your disagreement in high context cultures, people often take it very personally. And so there's less emphasis and less focus on debate and, a battle over which idea is the best or the most rational thought. It's more about maintaining that personal relationship and subtly over time encouraging someone to adopt what you feel is the correct point of view. Another thing to note in the territorial nature, so low context cultures like the US, many times we have a very fixed personal space bubble. Most people stay 3 to 6 feet apart, and you're not supposed to get close to someone or kind of get in their bubble. However, in high context cultures in Latin American, Middle Eastern, African, Asian cultures, many times that personal space is more viewed as communal, where people sit closer together. They don't always adhere to 3 to 6 feet distance. They more share space, and so that's important to remember. So if a student is maybe, I remember I had a student when I was teaching third grade, and she would always stand like right next to students, or she even when I was like explaining something, she would stand right next to me, and I kind of felt uncomfortable, and I was worried, maybe the student, was misunderstanding our professional relationship, but really the student was probably just that was the way she interacted with her family. And so when I watched how she talked to her mom and to her brothers and sisters, I noticed that she was also right next to them, and they basically shared the same space. And so I think that was more of her cultural expectations and her cultural norms of communication. Let's shift now to questioning techniques. So we've talked about the different ways to provide comprehensible input. We've described developmentally appropriate communication. We've discussed culturally appropriate communication. Now we're going to get into questioning. Questioning is a key component of the type of communication you will use as an educator. So first of all, when you're forming questions, you have to think about them before you even teach the lesson. You should plan them out. And questioning should occur in all parts of the lesson. It should occur first at the beginning of the lesson. And the reason why you would ask students questions at the beginning of the lesson is to activate their prior knowledge, or to ask them to reflect on what they've learned before or what they already know from their experiences at home or in earlier grades. Sorry about that. Another thing to remember is that during a lesson, you also need to ask questions throughout the lesson when you're teaching it. And then also when you're modeling the activity and you're having students practice with you, the teacher, or with their peers during the guided practice stage, it's important that you also provide questions as kind of like quick informal assessments to see if students are understanding what you're saying. Another thing is, of course, you're going to ask questions at the end of the lesson, and this can be in the form of kind of asking them what they remembered, asking them brief and formal questions about the key components of the lesson, and of course, when you give them the assessment at the very end of the lesson, you're going to ask different types of questions to kind of understand whether students understood the lesson or not. Another thing to remember when you're asking questions is you need to actively involve students. So one way you can do that is to have students compose their own questions, ask their questions to each other, and then respond to each other's questions. Another way you can do this is whenever you pose a question to the class, before you have students, you call on a student to answer, have students turn and talk to each other, or get together in a small group and share their point of view. Then, after students have all had the opportunity to discuss their thoughts, you can call on a few students that are volunteering to share their group's answer. So even if a student doesn't necessarily want to present their ideas in front of the whole class, they still had an opportunity to share their point of view and to participate in their small groups or in their partner groups. Another thing to note when you're providing questioning is that you want to make sure that your questions go from all spectrums of the level of rigor available. So if you're using either Bloom's taxonomy or Webb's depth of knowledge to determine the level of rigor or difficulty level of your lesson, make sure you're asking questions that are both kind of at the lower level of rigor, like what is photosynthesis, to also questions that are at the higher level of rigor or difficulty, like why is photosynthesis important, or how does photosynthesis relate to another concept. So you want to have both low level or low order thinking questions, but you don't want to stay there. You want to have primarily, eventually, higher order thinking questions. And so higher order thinking questions in general are not one-word questions or one-word answers. They normally require students to think for a significant amount of time before they answer, and there's not necessarily one right answer. And so that kind of goes into our next point. It's important that the kind of questions you ask are a mixture of divergent or open-ended questions and convergent or one correct answer questions. You want to expose students to different types of thinking and the different types of questions they might see on standardized tests. And as you may know, in many standardized tests, there's lots of short answer responses, or there's also times when students might have to justify their opinion in some way, orally or in written form. And so many times students are going to have to think and answer things in a divergent way where there's not just one correct answer. They have to justify their point of view or their opinion based on evidence or their experiences. And so it's important to give students practice with that in the classroom itself. And like we talked about earlier, the good thing about divergent questions or open-ended questions is that many times those are higher order thinking questions that really make students think, that really challenge the students. And so many times those divergent questions or those higher order thinking skills, those critical thinking questions, start with words like why or how. The best types of questions, so when you're writing your questions, this kind of got cut off a little bit, but the best types of questions are clear and succinct, so they're straight to the point. They also should require extended thinking, so students should really have to think. They shouldn't just be having to regurgitate information or recall facts that they just memorized. Furthermore, effective questions also ideally are open-ended, so they have various correct answers. So many different students can express their opinion, and many different students can engage in the question. And also, you can call on many different students. If you only ask single-answer questions, you're going to have to ask a lot of questions to get to have every student have the opportunity to answer a question. However, if you provide a few really interesting and thought-provoking open-ended questions that are divergent, then you could call on several different students for just one question, and then each of them could have a different answer. Another thing to note is that when you're making your lessons, you kind of like I mentioned earlier, it's great to have some key or critical thinking questions that you've already kind of written out. And this will look good for your administrator, and also will be a good guide for you to remember what questions or what key questions you want students to be able to answer at the end of the lesson. Another thing about questions is you want to make sure that they're beneficial for all students. So we've talked about this already, but you want to make sure students are actively involved. You want to make sure that all different ability and language levels can understand the question and participate in the question. And many times one way to support that is through providing contextual support like visuals or practice opportunities or peer modeling. Another way you could do this is by providing a sentence stem to model for students how to answer a question. So like, I think that, or in my opinion, blank, and then students have to fill in that blank. And so it models to students how to speak in a complete sentence and how to answer a given sentence and a given question. And that could be beneficial for students who are beginner or intermediate English language learners who may understand the concepts but have trouble formulating complete sentences. Another thing is when you create questions, oh, that's my cat, Tequila. When you create questions, another thing that's very important is that you have some of your questions involve divergent thinking. So where students have to consider other viewpoints or positions that are different than their own. This way it kind of opens up their mind and it exposes them to differences which they're going to experience when they get out into the real world, when not all of their coworkers or all their classmates think the same way. It's my cat again. Okay, tequila. Okay. Another thing is, we talked about higher order thinking skills with the questions, but make sure you're referring to Bloom's taxonomy or Webb's depth of knowledge and having those charts available for you, and maybe check off each time you ask a question at each level of thinking. So maybe you ask a question about where students have to remember something, or you ask a question where students have to define or describe something, and then you ask a question about how they have to apply the concept to a new situation, and then analyze the new information, or even evaluate the importance or make a judgment about the information, and finally create their own concept of the information. Some other guidelines for asking questions. Some other guidelines for asking questions is you want to make sure that you plan ahead of time ways that you can incorporate all students. So we've talked about turn and talk, but another way is using digital tools like Poll Everywhere, where students post with their phones their comments or their thought process. You could have students write down their responses on a whiteboard and show them to you or to their partners, and that way all students have a chance to answer. Make sure that when you're posing your questions, you incorporate the learner in the thinking process. So you directly engage them and make them actively involved. So think of a time when. So that means the student has to personally think, or be ready to explain this, or be ready to justify this concept. This kind of keeps students' minds on the topic. They're engaged, keeps them on their toes, and actively learning. Another thing is you want to make sure you provide wait time. If you provide wait time, at least 8 seconds after you ask a question, before you call on someone, if you provide wait time, that will be very beneficial, because the wait time will make sure that every student has an opportunity to at least think about their answer. If you don't provide wait time and you go straight to calling on students, then that sends the message that not all students have to be engaged and to think of an answer, because only a select few, the ones that raise their hands first, will be the ones that get chosen. So then what happens is only the able or active learners that are raising their hands are the ones thinking of the answer, while the rest of the students are just kind of zoning out, waiting for the outgoing students, the teacher pleasers, I guess you could say, to say their answer and save the less ambitious students thinking time, or save less thinking effort for them. So basically, a less ambitious student could choose to just kind of sit back and let other people answer the questions for them and not really have to think of their own answer. That's why we have wait time, which makes sure all students have at least to think of their own answer. They might not have to share it with you out loud to the whole class, but they're at least, you know that they've had at least 8 seconds to think on their own what is the answer. Sorry. Some other guidelines for asking questions. Oh, gosh. There it goes. Is you want to make sure that you call on the student who has the correct answer. It's beneficial for students to hear the right answer. There's a couple reasons. First of all, it saves students self-esteem. I mean, who wants to be called on and then later heard that their answer is wrong in front of their peers? Probably no one, right? No one wants to be wrong, especially in front of their peers. Another thing is, it also avoids cognitive dissonance or confusion. So if students hear a lot of wrong answers and then one right answer, they might remember only the wrong answers and not the right answer. So there's different ways you can ensure that you're actually calling on the student who knows the correct answer. So one way is, when you're doing those turn and talk or partner talk activities, you as a teacher are walking by and listening into what people say. That way you know who was on task and who has the correct answer, and who would be a good person to share with out loud with in front of the class as the model correct answer. Another way is, if you are unable to really listen to every single person talk with their partner, another way to tell is just by looking at who's engaged, who's paying attention, who did well on the guided practice activities, who historically has done well in answering questions out loud. But once again, you can have questions of all different difficulty levels and all different rigor levels. And so you can try to provide questions that would be appropriate for different types of students. So maybe your students who are beginner English language learners, or students that maybe are struggling to understand a concept, you might ask them a very basic question that is not too hard for them to remember. But if you have a more advanced student, like your able learners or your gifted and talented students, you might ask them in front of the class the critical thinking question. To make that really requires a lot of thought. Either way, whatever you do, you want to make sure that you involve all students. And if students are interested and they are volunteering, make sure you're calling on each student who is volunteering to share their answer. Don't just call on the select few that you know have the right answer and who always get it right. Another thing to remember is it's important that you provide wait time. We've talked about that already. Make sure that students think of their own answer before they hear the right answer or you tell them the right answer. Also, make sure you have a strategy or a routine for what happens when students shout out an answer. So normally when students shout out an answer, you don't want to completely ignore them because they're going to keep on shouting out answers until you pay attention to them, which will cause more distraction. So if someone shouts out an answer, you might have a symbol, like a signal that you've taught to students to remind them to raise their hand. I always did this to remind students to raise their hand. Or if students shout out a correct answer, you might nod to them, but then call on someone who's raising their hand. And then explain to students, please remember that I'm trying to call on students who are quiet, raising their hands, and are in their seats. Another thing to remember is you have to think about how you can provide support for students who provide partial answers. So this is for students who maybe have answered some of the question correctly, or got started in the right direction but kind of wavered off, or maybe got stuck. You have to think about how can you support these students. So one way to do this is provide probing questions. So having them asking additional questions, kind of like smaller questions, to get them to the big question. Or for younger students, and it really depends on your classroom community as well, sometimes younger students enjoy asking a friend to help them out. And then they can agree or disagree with what the friend said, and then they share out their answer. So sometimes that can be nice because it kind of saves the student's reputation and also builds camaraderie because they're getting help from their friends. Like we said before, make sure all students have at least one opportunity to participate in an activity. Kind of talked about turn and talk already. This is important. Don't have students guess if they don't know their answer. If students don't know the answer, you don't want them to guess because they're most likely going to guess incorrectly. Also, it once again puts emphasis on the fact that they really don't know the answer, so it kind of makes them look bad. So instead, if they say they don't know, then you can dignify their response or dignify what their situation and say, well, I know this is a really difficult question. I've struggled with this question myself, and thank you for your effort. And then move on to somebody else who does know the question. So you could even have them pass or ask a friend, depending on the grade level, on whether you think that would work in your classroom community. Or also, something to note, and I think I've kind of misspoken, you don't want to directly call on another student right away. And the reason why you don't want to call on another student right away after someone has given an incorrect or partially correct answer is because that makes the first student who got it wrong look bad. And it could even cause some competition or bitter feelings between students, and you don't want that. So if a student says an incorrect answer or doesn't know an answer, you should answer it yourself, the teacher. I kind of misspoke. You, the teacher, should be the one that gives the correct answer. That way, not only are you dignifying that student's response by saying, yes, this was a very difficult question, or I appreciate your effort, but also you're not making the student look bad by having another student kind of one-up them in front of the whole class. Another thing is, do not use specific questions just to get students' attention. So many times if a student's not paying attention and you give them a question, they're very likely to get it wrong. Also, another problem with that is that not only are you setting them up for failure, but it could also embarrass students again. And it could confuse the students who are paying attention because they're hearing a bunch of wrong answers from students who weren't paying attention. However, another way to do this is to give them a really basic, simple yes or no question that is really straightforward that everyone can answer even if they weren't paying attention. And this can kind of bring back the student to the lesson and kind of remind the student subtly that you are paying attention as the teacher and you notice the student is getting distracted and off task. So a question like this might be, this is a really interesting topic, right, Thomas? Or this really makes me think, right, Thomas? Or something like that. So something that students can just say right or yes. And they're, of course, going to get correct and they're going to get to participate in front of their students, but it's not going to embarrass them. So when you respond to questions as a teacher, first of all, it's very important to recognize correct responses. And then not only are you saying yes or that's right, but you're telling students why it's correct. And you can do this both verbally, by saying out loud to the class, or nodding to students, or smiling. But as much as possible, if students are raising their hand and answering a question in an appropriate manner, as much as possible you want to not only give them praise for their answer that was correct, but also reiterate why it was correct to students. Once again, for students who do not know the answer, try to ask the question again. Maybe they just misheard it or needed another time or more time to think about it. Restate or rephrase the question if needed, because sometimes it could just be a language issue. They're just not understanding the way you're phrasing the question. Provide hints or clues or supports. And if the student cannot figure it out, remember the teacher should answer it. Don't move on to another student because that would embarrass the first student who had trouble with the question. We talked about how we don't want to have students guess the answer. Remember, that can cause a bunch of wrong answers being shouted out, and also students would kind of lose some self-esteem if they're getting it incorrect. We talked about the importance of not asking questions just to get students' attention. Oh, there it is. I think I went backwards for some reason. For incorrect answers, so this is not just for students who don't know the answer, but let's say they tried and they got it wrong. So you should repeat what the student said. This is kind of like validating their answer and their effort. Like they tried, then you give them praise, like that was a really good try or a really good attempt. And this is a hard question. Then, if there are any partially correct parts of the answer, you could recognize that and emphasize that. But then, at the end, you need to provide the correct answer and an explanation of why. This way, all the other students don't transfer any incorrect information into their long-term memory. Remember, the teacher should finally provide the final, complete answer. You shouldn't call on another student to answer it. For open-ended questions, try to provide several different opinions and different opportunities for students to answer. And maybe try to build on students' answers to get other students to start to participate or to connect the answers together to show that students have things in common and to build a classroom community. You should not repeat answers as a general practice. It shouldn't just be like a habit, because that can be kind of boring and students will start to tone you out because they know you're just going to repeat the answer for the first 20 seconds before you get to another question or another answer. So instead, you should only repeat the answer for a specific purpose. So first of all, you could repeat the answer if you want to clarify or extend the answer. Another time you could repeat the answer is if you want to repeat an incorrect answer to provide validation for students' effort. And remember, we just went over the process of how to deal with that with an incorrect answer. A third time you might repeat an answer is maybe students had trouble hearing the correct answer. Maybe the student was whispering, or they didn't enunciate clearly, or they might have used incorrect grammar, and so you need to repeat or rephrase the question with correct grammar using appropriate academic vocabulary. Or maybe just students couldn't hear it because of background noise. So in that case, it is justified to repeat students' answers. There's different, lots of allergies. There's different times that you should support students during the lesson delivery cycle. And this will help you with your communication practices overall, but it'll also be something that will be useful when you're just instructing students at each phase of the lesson plan. So during the explicit instruction phase, the I do phase, when the teacher is explicitly teaching the information, or it's teacher-led instruction, many times it's beneficial to model through a think aloud, like where the teacher says they're thinking at each step, and they're modeling to the class, or they might have students model to the class their think aloud. So you might choose a student, not pick on like bother, but choose a student to answer a question. But when they're answering the question, ask them questions or ask them to think aloud or to explain the rationale for why they got their answer. Make sure also during explicit instruction to post directions, the process and steps for each activity. Another thing is it's important to provide a picture, an example, or an exemplar of the desired work once it's that you're expecting from students. This will give students an idea of what your expectations are, and also can give them an idea of how to complete the project, what the final project will look like. Make sure you keep your directions or your steps and your examples of how to complete an example question or an example activity on the board so that students can reference that when they're working on their own. For guided practice, when students are working with their partners and working with you, the teacher, to practice with the material, make sure that you provide students opportunities to work with you at the same time in which you can give them immediate feedback and guidance. Also, make sure you're providing clear instructions for when students do work in groups. What are your expectations? What kind of work or output you want students to produce, and how students will be held accountable for their work. Another thing is, for guided practice, is that also make sure you could model to students how to ask certain questions and give students feedback in sentence stems to help them in asking questions to each other, and also how they give each other feedback and how they answer the questions. So some sentence stems to model how to ask for clarification when they're working with their partners could be, what do you think about, or could we also consider blank? And then some sentence stems to help students provide constructive feedback to their partners instead of just saying, you're wrong, could be, this is a great start. What if we did this? Or this could be more effective if, or why don't we try to elaborate on this by... Many times you'll have to model to students this is going back to the previous slide, but many times you're going to have to model to students appropriate ways to communicate because they might not have heard that at home or in earlier grades. They might have just been used to just disagreeing and arguing, and that's not what you want. You want to show them how to positively and cooperatively express your point of view while also maintaining a cordial and professional and productive group environment. Another thing is when you're communicating for students during the independent practice stage, when the you do stage or when students are working on their own, when you're helping individual students, try to bend down to their level as much as possible. This way, you're kind of not calling attention to that student who needs help, and also it's less likely to distract from other students who are working. Just make sure you don't violate students' personal space when you're doing this. When you see a student who needs help, make sure you always praise the student for their effort, how they've gotten started on the work, how they're trying, how they're interested and they want to be successful, and they're asking good questions, or they're made some great progress, or that they have the ability to answer this question. They're very smart and they can answer it. So praise is very important. Another thing to remember is during the independent practice stage, you can ask students probing questions rather than just telling them the answer. This way, the probing questions kind of make them think back and reflect, what is the key part that they're not understanding? So what are you having trouble with? Or have you tried this? Or have you completed this step? This has students kind of see if you can have students solve on their own the problem before you have to actually give even more clues or help. Finally, if students can't answer the question with the probing questions, then provide them guided questions to really get them to the point. But once again, you don't want to straightforward tell them the answer. You want to show them and get them to kind of get there on their own. So guided questions might be, how about if we try this? Or do you remember this example? Or let's work another example together and think out loud how we did it. Or what type of question is this, and what process have we learned to deal with these types of questions? This way, the student is coming to the answer on their own, and they still feel like they're autonomous and they have utility and they're productive, and that you're not just force feeding them the answer. So if students cannot figure out how to proceed with guided questions, another thing is just model a similar problem or review some of the guided practice examples you did or an earlier activity that students were successful on. That can kind of build up their self-esteem. You could also provide notes or example problems or feedback that's written down for students to reference on their own. That way you can go off and help another student, and if a student gets stuck, they can look back at your notes or your feedback or the example problem and try to be able to do it on their own. They're more likely to continue to work independently while you help other students that need help, rather than right when they finish that question, they get to another question, they get stuck and they don't know what to do, and then they raise their hand again. And so instead of having to stay with the same student over and over, if you give them notes and examples or specific written feedback that students can reference, sometimes students can figure it out on their own, and then they can kind of teach themselves, so you can now work on with other students one-on-one that need additional support. Make sure that you don't just stay with that student once they're for the whole time. If the student, you want to get them started, you want to get them to be successfully progressing in the assignment, and once they're starting to progress, move on to another student. That way you can have the opportunity to interact with each student and build that culture of care, so that each student feels valuable and respected, and that you have an interest in each student's academic success. But also it builds up the students and the student who needs help. If you just stay there and hover over them, they kind of feel like you don't really have a lot of respect and confidence in them. And so that can hurt their feeling of autonomy and utility. Also, another thing is that they might become dependent on you instead. So we're going to now talk about in the next slide a great, easy way to remember how to help students during independent practice. So this strategy is called the praise, prompt, and leave. And this is useful, especially when you're working with students during the independent practice stage, when they're working on their own, and you're kind of walking around giving students feedback and support. So first of all, when you see a student that's struggling or they're raising their hand for help, first of all, go to them, praise them by giving them immediate positive feedback. And if students have some correct answers on their paper or they've already done some things correct, positively recognize the correct elements. Next, for the parts they don't understand, prompt by asking them additional questions or providing additional supports to make students to think about the immediate step they're stuck on. So asking those guided questions. What can we do here? Or how is this similar to this practice example? Finally, once students start to progress, once again, we leave. We don't leave the classroom, but we leave and move to help another student. We want to make sure that we're providing support for all students and not just sitting there focusing on one student. And some students will want to monopolize your attention. I mean, they really want, maybe unfortunately they're not getting enough attention at home, or maybe they just really love you as a teacher, which is hopefully more likely that you're such a wonderful teacher, everyone wants to spend all their time with you. Well, you can't just spend all of the class period with one student. You need to be moving around. So you want to praise them, get them focused and build up their self-esteem, prompt them, give them guided questions to come to the answer on their own and to start making progress. And then you want to move on or leave that one student and move on and help another student. You can still come back to that student that was struggling, but you want to make sure that you're letting that student become independent while also you're recognizing that other students are valuable as well. Thank you so much for listening to this lesson. I hope you enjoyed all of the ideas. If you have any questions, please email me. Thank you very much. Oops, sorry, there was one more thing. I forgot about that. I also have some general communication tips for teachers. So first of all, make sure that you communicate based on students' learning styles. So if students are visual learners, you want to provide a lot of visual support. If students are very mathematical learners or mechanical learners maybe, then you might want to give them some physical activities to complete. Or if they're very interpersonal learners, then you want to make sure that you provide them with regular opportunities to interact with their peers. We've talked about this already, but make sure that the vocabulary, the language you use is relevant to students. And try to provide examples from their lives and from their experiences. And try to relate whatever you're teaching to what they've seen in their homes or in their outside of school experiences or what they've seen in earlier grades so that they can kind of connect the lesson to their prior knowledge. Whenever you're writing, for any kind of written communication, either email, a paper for students, like a response or feedback for students, or a letter home to parents, anything that's written down, remember, before you write it, that things that are written are permanent. Even if you think you can delete it later online, most likely there is some kind of saved document that is stored maybe in the cloud somewhere. Who knows exactly where it's saved. But many times, even if you delete it later, it's still there. And so before you write something that could be embarrassing or that could upset another person, think about, would I want this, whatever I'm writing, to be published in the newspaper or for all my friends and family on Facebook? Because most likely, any kind of electronic communication or written communication could be posted to the newspaper, to Facebook. So make sure that whatever you're writing is a positive representation of you and your values and your teaching and the way you treat students in a positive manner. This is important. We kind of talked about this with culturally appropriate communication, but be aware of your own body language as well. So when I communicate, I actually sometimes you might have even noticed, I sometimes hunch over, and that can kind of unfortunately show to some cultures or to some people that that person's less trustworthy. Or I used to sometimes I would cross my arms like this, and I'd be thinking. And for me, that was just showing that I'm thinking about something. But for other cultures or for other people, crossed arms can show that you're closed off and you're not interested in communicating. So just be very careful about your nonverbal communication. Or sometimes if you are frustrated with a student, you might unintentionally frown, or you might even smirk or even laugh if a student is doing something silly. You want to be careful because you don't want to embarrass a student or reinforce negative behavior by laughing with the student or smiling when they do something that maybe is inappropriate, like they're making a class joke or something out loud, being the class clown. Another thing is, for communication, you always want to have regular communication with all stakeholders. So you need to have regular communication with your fellow teachers, especially special education teachers who might share the same student, or PE teachers, or any other teachers either that have the same students or are on your same grade level, or who you interact with and exchange work with. You also want to make sure you have regular communication with administrators. If they're emailing you, it's a good idea to email them back within the same day. Another thing is, same thing with parents. Have regular communication with parents. Send home, at least as much as possible, a weekly form of communication. It could be just a simple note. It could be a graded paper with a comment on it. It could be there's different programs now that teachers can kind of like text comments to parents, like through Class Dojo, for example. Or there's these teleparent programs where they can send home a recorded message to parents. And so having a way to regularly communicate with parents is very beneficial. Finally, when you start to disagree with either your students or peer or colleague or even an administrator, try to use reflective listening before you right away respond. So reflective listening is basically you're thinking about, where is this person coming from? How could the way they're expressing their point of view be related to how they were raised or their culture? And also, reflective listening in general assumes positive intent. So I'm going to give an example. I had a parent that many times the way she was talking to us was very directive and imperative, like kind of like ordering us to do things. And so that kind of frustrated myself and some other teacher colleagues. But then before I let this get too frustrating and maybe said to the parent, "Oh, you can't talk to me like that," before I let that get there, I kind of stopped and thought about it. So this parent was probably, unfortunately, she was probably working in very kind of menial jobs in a factory, and she was probably not used to having a lot of authority in her life. She was most of the time probably being ordered around by her boss or ordered around by people in power and charge. And so maybe that was the way she was used to communicating with people. And so instead of being so frustrated with the way that parent spoke to me in such a direct, informal kind of imperative, ordering way, Instead, I thought about that and I thought, well, okay, so maybe this is the way she communicates. But I'm going to model to her how I communicate in a respectful and professional way. And eventually, when I communicated that way to the parent started to shift and change the way she started to communicate as well. So it kind of got, maybe she learned more about American or US culture, or not just US culture, but maybe she learned more about professional culture. Maybe she had not really been in a professional environment before or worked with someone in an academic setting this way. She probably did not have a lot of formal schooling, and so she was learning now how to interact with educators and how to interact in a professional situation. Thank you. I believe this is the end. I appreciate it. Thanks for your attention. Have a great day and talk to you all soon.